My straight lab partner kept finding excuses to touch my hand. Gay love story. Hello everyone, and welcome back. If you enjoy emotional gay love stories with romance, powerful twists, and unforgettable endings, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. We love seeing viewers from all over the world. Thank you for being here. Now let's dive into today's story. That was the 5th time Dylan Parker touched my hand today, and unless advanced biochemistry had suddenly become a contact sport, I was starting to have questions. Caleb Morgan stared down at Dylan's fingers resting lightly across his knuckles beside the microscope, trying very hard to remember how breathing worked. Dylan, meanwhile, looked completely unbothered. "You're holding it wrong," he said. Caleb glanced at the sample tray, then at Dylan's hand, then back at Dylan. "I'm holding a pen." Dylan paused. His dark eyes flicked toward the pen as though this information had personally betrayed him. "Yeah, I know. Do you?" Caleb asked. Dylan released him and cleared his throat. "Your grip looked weird." "Right. Obviously. The dangerous pen grip. Leading cause of death among college seniors." Caleb turned back toward his notebook before his face could expose him. This was precisely why developing a crush on your straight lab partner was a terrible idea. Caleb had known that from day one. 6 weeks earlier, Professor Whitmore had announced semester partners, and Dylan Parker had dropped into the stool beside Caleb with an easy smile and said, "Guess you're stuck with me." Caleb had looked at the broad-shouldered basketball player with annoyingly good hair and immediately established a private emergency protocol. Rule 1. Dylan was straight. Rule 2. Caleb was not going to develop feelings for Dylan. Rule 3. If Rule 2 failed, deny everything until graduation. It was an excellent system. It had survived approximately 4 days. Dylan was friendly in the most inconvenient ways possible. He remembered Caleb took his coffee with oat milk. He saved him a seat before lectures. He sent terrible science memes at midnight and somehow made Caleb laugh at jokes involving mitochondria. None of that necessarily meant anything. Dylan was apparently just nice. Suspiciously nice. The touching, however, was becoming harder to file under normal heterosexual lab partner behavior. That morning alone, Dylan had brushed Caleb's fingers while taking a pipette, adjusted the cuff of Caleb's glove, steadied his wrist during a measurement Caleb had performed perfectly 50 times before, and removed an invisible speck from the back of his hand. Now came the pen emergency. Caleb quietly moved his hand 6 inches farther across the table. Dylan noticed. Caleb knew he noticed because Dylan's gaze followed it for half a second before returning to the microscope. "You okay?" Dylan asked. "Fantastic. You look nervous." "That's just my face." Dylan smiled, and there it was again, that soft, crooked smile that made Caleb's brain temporarily resign from active service. "Your face is nervous?" "Genetically." Dylan laughed under his breath and leaned closer to examine their results. His shoulder bumped Caleb's. Caleb went perfectly still. There were 3 empty stools on Dylan's other side. 3. Caleb had counted. He was not proud of counting, but apparently this was his life now. "Caleb," Dylan murmured. "Yeah. I need your hand." Caleb's heart performed something medically irresponsible. He slowly looked over. Dylan held out the pipette with an innocent expression. "For the calibration." "Of course. The calibration." Caleb handed him the instrument carefully, making absolutely certain their fingers didn't touch. For one strange second, Dylan looked almost disappointed. Caleb immediately dismissed the thought. "No, absolutely not." Dylan Parker was straight. Dylan Parker had mentioned an ex-girlfriend during their 2nd week together. Dylan Parker was simply friendly, tactile, and apparently deeply concerned about Caleb's hand-related laboratory technique. That was all. Caleb returned to his notes and underlined a measurement twice. Beside him, Dylan quietly shifted closer again. Then his knuckles brushed Caleb's hand beneath the edge of the table. Caleb stopped writing. Dylan didn't move away. And for the first time, Caleb wondered whether the problem wasn't that he was imagining things. Maybe the problem was that Dylan was running out of excuses. Caleb spent the rest of Tuesday pretending the moment beneath the table had never happened, which would have been considerably easier if Dylan had not spent Wednesday behaving like personal space was an optional feature. By 9:15 in the morning, Caleb had developed 3 rules for surviving the remaining 5 weeks of their project. Dylan was straight. Friendly touching meant nothing. And under no circumstances would Caleb become the guy who mistook ordinary kindness for flirting. These were sensible rules. Mature rules. Rules Dylan apparently considered a personal challenge. Your glove is folded, Dylan said. Caleb looked down at his left hand. The blue nitrile glove appeared perfectly normal. Where? Dylan leaned closer. There. He gently straightened a tiny wrinkle near Caleb's wrist. Caleb stared at him. You saved me. I try. Another 10 seconds, and that wrinkle could have destroyed my academic career. Dylan grinned. You joke, but laboratory safety matters. Professor Whitmore should give you a medal. Dylan laughed and returned to their samples. Caleb attempted to do the same, except his brain had begun keeping records. Touch number 1, glove emergency. 11 minutes later came touch number 2. Dylan stood behind Caleb while they calibrated the pipette and placed his hand lightly over Caleb's. Like this, Dylan said. Caleb looked sideways. Dylan, what? I know how to use a pipette. I know. I got a 98 on the practical. I remember. Caleb slowly turned his head. Then what exactly are you teaching me? Dylan opened his mouth. Nothing emerged. For one glorious second, the famously relaxed Dylan Parker looked genuinely confused by his own behavior. Then he stepped away. Consistency. Naturally. By lunch, Caleb was losing his mind with scientific precision. He started noticing everything. Dylan always chose the stool beside him even when half the laboratory was empty. When Caleb reached for something, Dylan somehow reached for the same thing. When Caleb passed him a marker, Dylan took it from the exact end Caleb was holding. Maybe Dylan was simply tactile. Caleb watched him interact with Madison Reed while she borrowed their calculator. No touching. Dylan handed Professor Whitmore a folder. Plenty of clearance between fingers. Another student asked for a pen. Dylan practically delivered it by air traffic control. Caleb narrowed his eyes. This was becoming data. Dangerous, hope-producing data. During their afternoon break, Dylan disappeared and returned carrying 2 coffees. He placed one beside Caleb. Oat milk, 1 sugar. Caleb blinked. You remembered? Dylan shrugged, suddenly fascinated by his own cup. You order the same thing every time. Something warm and deeply inconvenient settled in Caleb's chest. Thanks. Sure. Their eyes met for half a second too long. Caleb looked away first. He needed evidence against this theory immediately. Fortunately, Dylan provided it 20 minutes later. They were labeling sample tubes when his phone lit up beside the microscope. A photograph appeared on the screen. Dylan standing beside a smiling blonde woman at a lake. Caleb tried not to look. Dylan noticed anyway. That is Claire, he said. My ex-girlfriend. There it was. Exhibit A. Case closed. Caleb felt ridiculous for experiencing disappointment over information he already knew. She sent me an old photo. Dylan continued. We dated sophomore year. Cool. Caleb concentrated aggressively on a label. Dylan studied him. You okay? Why does everyone keep asking me that? Because you just labeled sample 12 as sample 120. Caleb looked down. He had. Innovative numbering system. Dylan laughed softly. Caleb reached for another label. Their fingers met over the roll. Caleb immediately pulled back. Dylan did not. His hand remained there, suspended between them, and the smile faded slightly from his face. For the first time, Caleb noticed something he had somehow missed through all his own panic. Dylan looked nervous too. By Thursday afternoon, Caleb had decided there was only one responsible response to Dylan looking nervous after touching his hand. Conduct an experiment. Not a real experiment, obviously. Professor Whitmore would probably object to using a lab partner as an uncontrolled variable. This was private research. Caleb called it Operation Stop Being Delusional. The hypothesis was simple. If Dylan kept touching him because laboratory work naturally required close contact, removing those opportunities should make the touching disappear. Elegant, scientific, emotionally necessary. Caleb began with the pipettes. Instead of placing one directly into Dylan's hand, he set it on the counter 6 inches away. Thanks, Dylan said. Success. No contact. Caleb felt strangely disappointed by his own excellent methodology. Then Dylan reached across him for a marker sitting beside Caleb's elbow. His fingers brushed Caleb's knuckles. Caleb stared at the marker. There were 4 identical markers beside Dylan. 4. He counted twice because apparently heartbreak had transformed him into an inventory specialist. Dylan uncapped the marker as though nothing unusual had happened. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Fine. New trial. 20 minutes later, Caleb deliberately placed the sample labels on Dylan's side of the workstation. Dylan finished recording their measurements, glanced around, then leaned across Caleb to retrieve a completely different roll from the shelf behind him. His hand landed briefly over Caleb's as he steadied himself against the counter. Sorry, Dylan murmured. He did not sound particularly sorry. Caleb moved to the opposite stool. Dylan moved too. Caleb shifted the notebook between them. Dylan leaned around it. Caleb handed him a pen while holding only the very end, leaving nearly 5 inches of perfectly available plastic. Dylan somehow accepted it by touching Caleb's fingertips. Caleb froze. Dylan froze. The pen remained suspended between them like the world's least impressive romantic symbol. You know, Caleb said carefully, there is an entire pen available. Dylan glanced down. I see that. Most people grab the middle. Maybe I am not most people. That answer was unacceptable for several reasons, primarily because Caleb's heart reacted before his common sense could file an objection. Dylan finally took the pen and turned toward his notebook, but Caleb caught the faintest smile at the corner of his mouth. Oh, he was doing this on purpose. The realization arrived with terrifying clarity. Caleb suddenly replayed every glove adjustment, every unnecessary wrist correction, every shared marker and crowded stool. Maybe he had spent weeks protecting himself from signals that were actually signals. Maybe Dylan was trying to tell him something without saying it. Maybe Rule 1 had been wrong. Hope rose quickly enough to scare him. Then Madison walked past their station and noticed the photograph still displayed on Dylan's phone. Is that Claire? She asked. Dylan nodded. Yeah, we dated for almost a year. Madison smiled. You two were cute together. Dylan gave an awkward laugh. That was a long time ago. Caleb lowered his eyes to the sample sheet. There it was again, the reminder he needed. Ex-girlfriend. Straight. Simple. Whatever Dylan was doing, Caleb could not build a fantasy out of hand brushes and coffee orders. He focused on their data until the numbers blurred together. A few minutes later, Dylan quietly pushed a fresh coffee toward him. You seem tired. Caleb looked at the cup, then at Dylan. You already bought me one today. I know. Then why another? Dylan hesitated. For once, there was no quick joke. I like doing things for you. Caleb forgot the numbers entirely. Dylan seemed to realize what he had said and immediately looked down. Silence stretched between them. Then, almost unconsciously, Dylan's hand moved across the counter until his little finger rested against Caleb's. He did not pull away. Neither did Caleb. The experiment had officially failed, and Caleb had never been more afraid of wanting the wrong result. The first time Dylan stopped joking, Caleb knew something had changed. It happened the following Tuesday, almost a week after Operation Stop Being Delusional had produced results Caleb preferred not to discuss with himself. Their afternoon laboratory session had stretched past 6, leaving the science building unusually quiet. Professor Whitmore had already gone upstairs. Madison had left 20 minutes earlier, and Caleb and Dylan were finishing one final set of samples before calling it a night. Almost done, Caleb said, reaching across the workstation. Famous last words, Dylan replied. You said that 40 minutes ago. Science refuses to respect my schedule. Science also refuses to respect dinner. Caleb smiled. You are free to abandon me. Dylan looked at him immediately. Not happening. The answer came too quickly. Caleb pretended not to notice. He had become extremely talented at pretending not to notice things involving Dylan Parker. He reached for an empty glass flask near the edge of the counter, but his glove caught awkwardly against another piece of equipment. The flask slipped. Caleb instinctively tried to catch it, but it dropped onto the counter and cracked. Hold on, Dylan said sharply. Caleb stopped. A tiny piece of glass had left a shallow cut along the side of his finger. Nothing dramatic. Barely enough to justify the alarm suddenly written across Dylan's face. Dylan, I am fine. Let me see. It is basically a paper cut with better branding. Dylan was already beside him. He carefully took Caleb's hand and examined the small cut. All the teasing vanished from his expression. We need to clean this. We need to finish the samples. Caleb, something in Dylan's voice made him stop arguing. Dylan guided him to the sink, rinsed the small cut carefully, then found the first aid kit mounted nearby. Caleb watched him unwrap a bandage with intense concentration. You know I am not dying, right? Could you let me worry for 30 seconds? Caleb went quiet. Dylan placed the bandage around his finger, gentle and precise. Then he did something strange. He did nothing. The bandage was secure. The problem was solved. There was no scientific reason left for contact. But Dylan was still holding Caleb's hand. His thumb rested near Caleb's knuckles, perfectly still. Caleb could hear the ventilation system humming overhead. He could hear a clock somewhere down the hall. Mostly, he could hear his own thoughts screaming. Dylan. Dylan looked up. Their eyes met. For once, Caleb saw no easy smile, no convenient explanation, no joke waiting to rescue them. Dylan looked nervous, genuinely nervous. His gaze dropped briefly toward their hands, and understanding hit Caleb with startling force. This was not only happening to him. Dylan released him almost immediately. Sorry. Caleb stared at his bandaged finger. For what? I do not know. Dylan rubbed the back of his neck and stepped away. I just reacted. You looked terrified. You got hurt. I got a tiny cut. Still counts. Caleb smiled despite himself. You are very dramatic for a basketball player. Dylan finally laughed, but it sounded softer than usual. They returned to the workstation, leaving a careful foot of space between them. Neither mentioned what had happened. Neither needed to. For weeks, Caleb had assumed every accidental touch meant more to him than it did to Dylan. Now he was no longer sure. Because when Dylan had held his hand, Caleb had recognized the expression on his face. It was the same expression Caleb had been hiding since the semester began, wanting to stay close and having absolutely no idea what to do about it. For exactly 3 days after the bandage incident, Caleb made the catastrophic mistake of allowing himself hope. Not a lot of hope. He was not planning their future apartment or naming an imaginary golden retriever. He simply stopped treating every warm look from Dylan like evidence that needed to be thrown out of court. Maybe Dylan was confused. Maybe the ex-girlfriend did not explain everything. Maybe the way Dylan had held Caleb's hand in that empty laboratory had meant exactly what it felt like. By Friday afternoon, that tiny possibility had become dangerously comfortable. Dylan was back to sitting close beside him, although neither mentioned Tuesday. When Caleb reached for the microscope controls, Dylan's fingers rested beside his instead of immediately moving away. When they compared notes, their shoulders touched. When Caleb made a terrible joke about their samples developing more personality than either of them, Dylan laughed much harder than the joke deserved. Caleb was beginning to think hope might not be completely ridiculous. Then Madison Reed walked over and destroyed it in approximately 7 seconds. Okay, she said, stopping beside their workstation with a coffee in one hand. I have to ask. Caleb looked up. That sentence has never ended well. Madison ignored him. Her eyes moved from Caleb to Dylan, then down to where Dylan's hand was resting over Caleb's wrist while pointing at a line in their notes. Dylan seemed to notice at the same moment. He did not move. Madison smiled slowly. Are you two finally dating? Caleb's brain left the building. What? His voice came out much higher than intended. Nothing, Madison said innocently. You are always together. Dylan brings you coffee. You practically share a chair. And whatever this is. She gestured toward their hands. Caleb looked down. Dylan was still touching him. Worse, Dylan was staring at Caleb instead of Madison. For one impossible second, Caleb thought Dylan might say something that changed everything. Dylan's fingers remained around his wrist. His expression softened. Then Madison laughed. Come on, Parker. You have to admit it looks suspicious. Dylan finally blinked. His hand slipped away. I am straight, he said. 3 ordinary words. Nothing cruel about them. Nothing dramatic. Still, Caleb felt something inside him quietly fold shut. Madison lifted both hands. Okay. I was kidding. Dylan gave a short laugh. We are just lab partners. Caleb smiled because apparently humiliation came with excellent acting skills. Exactly. Lab partners. Very glamorous. Madison moved on, already talking about Friday night plans. Caleb stared at the microscope. He had known. That was the worst part. Dylan had never promised him anything. Caleb had constructed an entire possibility from coffee cups, nervous smiles, and hands that lingered too long. Rule 1 had been correct from the beginning. Dylan was straight. Caleb was the one who had turned kindness into clues. You got quiet, Dylan said several minutes later. Concentrating. You hate concentrating. Personal growth. Dylan watched him carefully. Caleb moved his stool a few inches away. The distance felt enormous. The following Monday, Caleb arrived early and chose the chair opposite Dylan instead of beside him. He placed tools directly on the counter rather than passing them hand to hand. When Dylan reached toward his sleeve and said, "You have something," Caleb brushed it away himself. "Got it." Dylan's hand stopped in midair. "Right." At lunch, Dylan offered to grab coffee. Caleb lifted the cup he had brought from home. Already covered. Something flickered across Dylan's face. By Wednesday, their work had become painfully efficient. No accidental touches. No unnecessary closeness. No reasons for Caleb to wonder. He should have felt relieved. Instead, every inch of carefully maintained space hurt. Near the end of their session, Dylan finally set down his pen. "Did I do something?" Caleb kept his eyes on the data sheet. "No." "Then why are you avoiding me?" "I am not." "Caleb." Dylan's voice was quiet now. Caleb looked up despite himself. Dylan was not smiling. His gaze dropped toward Caleb's hands, safely folded in his own lap, then returned to his face. "It feels like I did." Caleb should have answered. He should have said something simple, something harmless, something that would let them finish the project without turning the laboratory into the most emotionally complicated room on campus. Instead, he looked at Dylan and said, "You did not do anything." Dylan leaned back slightly. "That sounds exactly like something people say when somebody definitely did something." "Congratulations. Your scientific reasoning is improving." Normally, Dylan would have laughed. This time he did not. "I am serious." Caleb looked down at the data sheet. "So am I." For the rest of Wednesday, Dylan stopped asking, but something between them had shifted. Caleb had expected distance to make everything easier. Instead, it seemed to confuse Dylan more every day. On Thursday morning, Dylan reached toward Caleb's wrist when he noticed the cuff of Caleb's glove had folded over. Halfway there, he stopped himself. His hand hovered for a second before dropping back to the counter. "Your glove," he said quietly. Caleb fixed it himself. "Thanks." Dylan nodded. 10 minutes later, Caleb nearly handed him a marker out of habit, remembered his new rules, and placed it on the table instead. Dylan stared at the marker as if it had personally offended him. By Friday, Dylan had become distracted enough that even Professor Whitmore noticed. "Parker, your measurements are usually cleaner than this," he said while reviewing their results. Dylan glanced toward Caleb before answering. "Sorry, Professor. I will redo them." Caleb pretended not to notice that glance. Pretending had become exhausting. During their afternoon break, Caleb sat outside the science building with his friend Noah Bennett, who had listened to the entire Dylan situation with the patience of someone watching a television show that refused to reach the season finale. "So he said he is straight," Noah said. "Yes. And now you are avoiding him." "I prefer emotionally responsible distancing." Noah took a sip of iced tea. "That is avoiding him with extra syllables." Caleb sighed. "I am trying not to make things weird." "How is that going?" Caleb looked through the glass doors. Dylan was inside, standing near their laboratory room and checking his phone. Even from 30 feet away, Caleb recognized the moment Dylan spotted him. His posture changed immediately. Then Dylan noticed Noah sitting beside him. Something unreadable crossed his face. "Perfectly," Caleb muttered. The next week became an accidental role reversal. Dylan started noticing every inch Caleb placed between them. He would pull out the stool beside himself, and Caleb would choose another. He would offer coffee, and Caleb would already have one. He would reach for a notebook, hesitate, then wait until Caleb put it down. The strangest part was how unhappy Dylan seemed about succeeding. On Tuesday evening, Caleb was packing his backpack when Dylan spoke behind him. "Are you seeing someone?" Caleb turned. "What?" Dylan looked almost embarrassed by the question. "That guy you were with Friday." "Noah." "Yeah. He is my friend." Dylan nodded too quickly. "Okay." Caleb stared at him. "Why?" "No reason." There it was again. Another excuse that explained absolutely nothing. Caleb zipped his backpack. "Good night, Dylan." He started toward the door. "Caleb." He stopped. Dylan stood beside the workstation, one hand resting against the edge of the counter. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something important. Instead, he asked, "Are we okay?" Caleb swallowed. "We are lab partners." The words landed differently this time. Dylan's expression changed. Caleb recognized them as the same words Dylan had used with Madison, but now neither of them was smiling. "Right," Dylan said softly. "Lab partners." Caleb walked away before hope could convince him to turn around. Behind him, Dylan remained alone in the laboratory, staring at the empty space where Caleb used to sit. Dylan discovered jealousy on a Thursday afternoon, and he hated it immediately. It arrived without warning while he was walking toward the science building and heard Caleb laughing near the campus coffee cart. Caleb was standing beside Noah Bennett again, but this time another guy was with them, tall, friendly-looking, wearing a navy jacket and holding 3 coffees. Dylan slowed without meaning to. The stranger handed Caleb a cup. Caleb smiled. Something unpleasant twisted inside Dylan's chest. Completely unreasonable. Completely ridiculous. Completely impossible to ignore. He entered the building before Caleb noticed him and spent the next 10 minutes telling himself he did not care who bought Caleb coffee. People bought people coffee every day. Dylan himself had bought Caleb coffee dozens of times. That thought somehow made everything worse. When Caleb finally entered the laboratory, Dylan was reorganizing a tray that had already been organized twice. "Hey," Caleb said. "Hey." Caleb placed his coffee beside his notebook. Dylan stared at it. Caleb noticed. "What?" "Nothing. You are glaring at my coffee." "I am not glaring." "Dylan, if that cup had feelings, it would be uncomfortable." Dylan looked away. "Who bought it?" Silence. Caleb blinked. "What?" "The coffee." Dylan immediately regretted speaking. "The guy outside." Caleb's expression changed from confusion to amusement. "His name is Lucas." "Okay. He is in Noah's economics class." "I did not ask." "You literally did." Dylan picked up a marker. "I was making conversation." Caleb smiled slightly. "Lucas asked if I wanted to get dinner sometime." The marker stopped moving. Dylan looked up. Caleb's smile disappeared when he saw his face. "Oh." Dylan swallowed. "Are you going to?" "Maybe." That one word followed Dylan for the rest of the afternoon. Maybe. Caleb dating someone should not matter. Caleb laughing with someone should not matter. Caleb letting someone else bring him coffee should definitely not matter. Dylan had said it himself. He was straight. He had dated Claire. He had always assumed the rest of his life would follow the same familiar pattern. So why did the thought of Caleb sitting across from Lucas at dinner make him feel like he had missed something important and could not get it back? That evening, Dylan sat alone in his apartment and finally stopped inventing explanations. He thought about Caleb's terrible jokes. Caleb concentrating so hard that he bit the inside of his cheek. Caleb pretending not to smile whenever Dylan remembered his coffee order. Caleb's hand beneath his in the laboratory. The small bandage around Caleb's finger. The empty stool that had appeared between them after Madison asked the question Dylan had answered too quickly. Then the truth arrived, quiet and terrifying. Dylan did not want Caleb to date Lucas because Dylan wanted to be the person sitting across from Caleb. He wanted the coffee runs, the late laboratory sessions, the ridiculous arguments over labeling samples. He wanted Caleb to stop moving away whenever their hands came close. Dylan covered his face with both hands. "Oh," he whispered into the empty apartment. It was not a complete answer about who he was. Maybe he did not have that answer yet. But for the first time, he understood that he did not need to solve his entire identity before admitting one simple thing. Whatever label eventually made sense, Caleb mattered to him in a way Claire never had, and every supposedly accidental touch had been Dylan reaching towards something he had been too confused to name. The next morning, Caleb arrived at the laboratory and found Dylan already waiting. Their eyes met. Dylan almost smiled, then stopped himself. Caleb placed his backpack down. "Morning. Morning." Dylan looked at Caleb's hand resting beside the notebook. His own fingers moved instinctively toward it, then stopped inches away. No excuse. This time, no glove to fix. No pipette to demonstrate. Nothing to hide behind. Caleb noticed the unfinished movement. Dylan slowly pulled his hand back. He was finally beginning to understand what he wanted. Now he had to figure out whether he had already waited too long. By the final week of the project, Caleb had become remarkably skilled at placing objects on tables instead of directly into Dylan's hand. Pens, sample sheets, pipettes, even a flash drive. If an object could theoretically produce finger contact, Caleb treated it like a diplomatic exchange between hostile nations. Dylan noticed every single time. Neither of them mentioned it. On Wednesday evening, they stayed late to finish the final report, and by 8:30 the laboratory had emptied completely. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while rain tapped softly against the tall windows. Caleb reviewed the last page, corrected one number, and slid the report across the counter. He stopped it several inches from Dylan's hand. Dylan stared at the paper. Then he stared at Caleb. "Okay." Caleb frowned. "Okay what?" "I cannot do this anymore." Caleb's stomach tightened. Do what? Dylan pushed his chair back and stood, not angry, just visibly nervous. This. Whatever happened between us? Caleb looked toward the report. Nothing happened between us. Exactly. That is somehow worse. Caleb almost laughed, but Dylan's expression stopped him. Why will you not touch me anymore? The question landed in the quiet room with nowhere to hide. Caleb stared at him. Seriously? Yes. You want to know why? I have been trying to figure it out for 2 weeks. Caleb stood too, keeping the counter between them. Because you told Madison you were straight. Dylan went silent. Caleb continued before courage abandoned him. And you were right to say it if that is who you are. But every time you touched my hand, every time you sat too close, every coffee, every ridiculous excuse to fix something I did not need fixed, it meant something to me. Dylan's face softened. Caleb, please let me finish. Caleb looked down at his hands. I started hoping. That was my mistake. Then you said we were just lab partners. And I realized I had taken a bunch of friendly gestures and turned them into something they were not. So I stopped giving myself reasons to misunderstand you. Silence followed. Dylan looked almost stunned. Then he gave a quiet, nervous laugh. You did not misunderstand me. Caleb looked up. What? Dylan rubbed his palms against his jeans. I misunderstood me. Caleb said nothing. Dylan took a breath. When Madison asked, I answered automatically. I have dated women. I always assumed straight was the answer because it had always been the easiest answer. He paused. Then you started avoiding me, and I hated it. Caleb's heart began doing deeply unhelpful things. Dylan continued. I hated that you stopped sitting beside me. I hated that you stopped letting me bring you coffee. Then I saw you with Lucas and realized I was jealous. Caleb blinked. You were jealous of Lucas? Extremely. I spent an embarrassing amount of time being angry at a cup of coffee. Despite everything, Caleb laughed. Dylan smiled briefly, then became serious again. I do not have every label figured out yet. I do not want to pretend I do. But I know something about you. He stepped closer to the counter, leaving plenty of space between them. Those touches were not accidents. Caleb forgot how to breathe. Dylan looked down at his own hand. Maybe the first one was. After that, I kept finding excuses because I did not understand why I wanted to. His voice softened. I do now. Caleb stared at him. Dylan, what are you saying? Dylan slowly placed his hand on the counter between them, palm open. He did not reach any farther. I am saying I like you. And I am saying I should have been honest instead of confusing both of us. Caleb looked at the hand that had caused 6 weeks of emotional chaos. Dylan waited. Can I? He asked quietly. No excuse. No experiment. No accidental brush of fingers. Just a question. Caleb looked up into Dylan's nervous eyes, then back at his waiting hand. For the first time since they met, the choice was completely his. Caleb had imagined this moment in at least 20 different ways, and somehow none of those imaginary versions included Dylan Parker standing beneath fluorescent laboratory lights with one hand open on the counter like the answer to the most unnecessarily complicated question in human history. Caleb stared at Dylan's palm. You are asking permission to hold my hand. Dylan swallowed. Yes. After spending 6 weeks touching it without filing the appropriate paperwork. A nervous smile appeared on Dylan's face. I have recently learned that my previous system had communication problems. Caleb tried to remain serious. He failed. A laugh escaped him, soft and relieved, and some of the tension finally disappeared from Dylan's shoulders. Caleb looked at the hand again. No glove emergency. No pipette lesson. No mysterious invisible speck. No excuse at all. Slowly, Caleb placed his hand in Dylan's. Dylan's fingers closed around his, careful at first, almost tentative. Then their fingers settled naturally together. Caleb felt something inside him finally become quiet. Okay, Dylan whispered. Caleb raised an eyebrow. That is your reaction? I am trying not to ruin this. You spent 3 weeks pretending my perfectly functional laboratory technique required constant physical supervision. I was confused. You corrected my pen grip. Dylan winced. That one was bad. There was nothing wrong with my pen grip. I know. You knew? Dylan looked embarrassed. I wanted to touch your hand. Caleb stared at him for 2 seconds before laughing again. Unbelievable. Dylan laughed too, and suddenly they were standing in the same laboratory where Caleb had spent weeks panicking, except nothing felt frightening anymore. Dylan's thumb moved gently across Caleb's knuckles, then stopped. Is this okay? The question mattered more than the touch. Caleb nodded. Yes. Dylan smiled, and Caleb realized this was different from every smile Dylan had given him before. There was no uncertainty hiding underneath it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Dylan's gaze dropped briefly to Caleb's lips, then returned to his eyes. "Can I kiss you?" he asked softly. Caleb's heart stumbled, but this time there was nothing to analyze and no reason to hide behind a joke. He nodded. "Yes." Dylan leaned in slowly, giving him every chance to change his mind, and Caleb closed the remaining distance. Their first kiss was gentle and brief, warm with all the feelings they had spent weeks disguising as accidents. When they pulled apart, Dylan stayed close, smiling with a kind of stunned happiness Caleb had never seen on him before. Caleb let out a quiet laugh. "So was that another experiment?" Dylan shook his head. "No excuse this time." Caleb squeezed his hand. "Good. What about Lucas?" Dylan asked. Caleb nearly groaned. "There is no Lucas situation. You said maybe. Because you were interrogating my coffee. I was jealous. You were jealous of a 12-ounce vanilla latte. It represented a threat." Caleb laughed so hard he had to look away. Dylan squeezed his hand lightly. "For the record, I am still figuring things out." Caleb's laughter softened. "I know. I do not want you to think I have everything magically solved. I do not need you to." Dylan studied him. Caleb squeezed his hand back. "Just do not make me guess anymore. Deal." They finished the report side by side, their shoulders occasionally touching, except now Caleb did not analyze every inch between them. 2 days later, Professor Whitmore returned their project with a 97 written across the top. Dylan stared at the grade. "We lost 3 points." Caleb looked horrified. "Our relationship is clearly doomed." Dylan laughed. "Relationship?" Caleb immediately became interested in packing his backpack. "Do not start. I just want a clarification. You are enjoying this too much." They walked out of the science building together into a cool Friday afternoon. Students crossed the quad beneath bright October trees, and for several steps neither spoke. Then Dylan's hand drifted toward Caleb's. Caleb noticed immediately. Of course he did. Dylan stopped before touching him. "Wait," Caleb said. Dylan looked over. Caleb nodded toward his hand. "What is the excuse this time?" Dylan smiled, softer now. "I do not have one." Caleb looked at him for a moment. 6 weeks ago, that answer would have terrified him. Now it felt wonderfully simple. "Good." Caleb reached over first and threaded their fingers together. Dylan's smile widened. They kept walking across campus, hand in hand, without pretending it was accidental, without checking who might notice, and without needing a laboratory explanation for any of it.